Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. In today's video, we are exploring Just Cause 4's graphics options on PC to provide you guys with an optimal set of settings that provides the perfect balance between visuals and performance. As Steve showed in his big GPU benchmark of the game, this title really runs like crap, especially on mid-tier and older hardware. So hopefully there's a few things we can tweak to get the game running better without much loss to visual quality. I think it's fair to say the game isn't the most visually attractive one released this year, and it certainly doesn't provide visuals that match the performance you get. While the lighting system and destructibility is impressive in some areas, the game is quite lacking as far as models, characters, textures, and a few other effects are concerned. It is a massive open world game with varied environments, but I feel perhaps too much time was spent making the world huge rather than focusing on these areas along with, general engine optimization. On top of that, there are a few frustrations with the PC version, such as a terrible menu system, especially for the graphics options, which requires you to scroll down the list to hit apply and then back every time you enter the graphics menu, yet you can't use your mouse's scroll wheel or escape or backspace for this. So yeah, not great there. And driving cars using keyboard controls also feels rather awful. I think that needs a bit of tweaking, I reckon. But perhaps the biggest omission are graphics presets. Just Cause 4 has 13 different graphics options, but there are no presets to nicely tie everything together for people that just want to play the game with minimal fuss. A lot of the settings are a simple yes/no toggle, but still a small selection of presets is pretty standard in PC games. That said, at least it runs above 60 FPS and at arbitrary resolutions, and you can change graphics settings without restarting the game, which is always nice. Before I get into the comparisons, there's some standard housekeeping to go over. Everything was tested using a variety of high-end and mid-range graphics cards from AMD and NVIDIA, so the numbers you see here should be representative of performance across most systems. However, we were using our Core i7 8700K test rig with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, so for the entirety of our testing, we were GPU bound. All the captures you see in this video were taken using an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2080 Ti at 4K, and we recommend watching this video at 4K for maximum quality. It's a bit easier to spot the differences in each setting at YouTube's highest quality mode. Or you can download a source quality file from our Patreon page. Anyway, let's get into it. First up is Anisotropic Level, which refers to, of course, anisotropic filtering. This is one of the most straightforward settings in most games. It governs how clear textures are at weird angles, and if you're playing the game with the maximum texture quality setting, we always recommend leaving anisotropic filtering on the maximum 16x setting as well. You can see in this shot that as the road curves up through the hills, having a higher AF level shows clearer road textures further into the distance. The choice of which setting to use is even easier when comparing the performance difference between 16x and 1x. Despite a large difference to visual quality, you'll gain almost nothing in terms of frame rate from choosing a lower setting. For this reason, 16x is an easy choice. Anti-aliasing is next up, and we have three choices here: temporal SMAA, FXAA without any temporal component, and no anti-aliasing. So there's only two very basic post-processing anti-aliasing methods available here, and to be honest, neither are really any good. The temporal SMAA mode in particular is absolute garbage. It's barely any better at removing shimmering and jagged edges than FXAA, yet it introduces horrible ghosting effects in motion due to the temporal component. This is a fast-paced game, so I wouldn't even consider using temporal SMAA due to the artifacting. FXAA is also a bad choice because it too doesn't do a great job of removing jagged edges, while no AA is of course also bad. So really there's no good anti-aliasing option in this title, which is very disappointing. In terms of performance, temporal SMAA causes a surprisingly high performance hit. Turning it down to FXAA will lead to 5% higher frame rates, and I reckon FXAA looks slightly better as well due to the lack of those ghosting effects. There's not much more performance to be gained from disabling anti-aliasing entirely. It's a real toss-up between FXAA and no AA here, depending on how you like your games to look. Texture quality is a simple affair. You want to keep it on the highest possible setting unless you run out of graphics memory, for example, on a super low-end GPU. Very high textures give noticeably sharper shadows than the other three settings, while understandably, low is the worst. Considering there is basically no performance difference between all four modes, again, the choice to use very high is simple for most people. Water quality is an interesting setting because the water effects in Just Cause 4 aren't amazing on the high settings. In fact, for the most part, they look pretty terrible and are one area that's received a bit of a downgrade compared to Just Cause 3. There is very little difference between the very high, high and medium modes, while low flattens out the water considerably and looks pretty bad. The main difference I spotted between the top 3 modes is the wake you leave while swimming. Medium disables this effect while it's still present on the high settings. Not that this effect looks good when enabled though. When you look at the performance difference, there's really not much point adjusting this setting. You'll only start to gain a significant amount moving to low, which looks pretty bad, and I'd only recommend that setting for those with low-end GPUs. For everyone else, I think very high is the way to go here. Ocean tessellation, surprise, surprise, only affects how the water surface looks in the ocean specifically. I didn't spot any changes to the water in the game's rivers, which have fewer waves. The visual difference is basically non-existent between the two settings, but curiously, disabling ocean tessellation actually leads to a performance reduction. My suspicion here is Just Cause 4 uses a slightly different ocean simulation depending on whether you have tessellation on or off, with tessellation providing better performance. LOD factor is another simple setting. It governs how many minor objects are in view and at what distance they appear. It doesn't seem to affect the foliage system in any significant way. Rather, the main change is in the village and city areas, with items on buildings and so forth disappearing on lower settings. There really isn't much difference between the 4 modes here, and when you look at the performance difference, this makes sense. It's only when you move down to medium or low that you are getting around a 2 to 3% performance improvement. Honestly, I think a lot of people could play on medium rather than very high without being able to spot many changes, but the frame rate improvement probably isn't worth slightly more noticeable pop-in as you're flying around. Just Cause 4's shadow system has 4 main types of shadows. We have very near shadows, which are the shadows closest to you, including your personal shadow. There's moderate shadows for things reasonably close to the camera, but more than a few meters away. There's far shadows when you have, your expansive view with large draw distances, and there's also cloud shadows. Cloud shadows are a bit strange in that they are updated at 1 to 2 FPS compared to the real-time updating for other shadows such as foliage, and that makes those cloud shadows look a bit weird if you look closely. Each of the 4 shadow modes simply governs the quality of the 4 shadow types, with very high having the sharpest, most realistic shadows, and then each successive setting noticeably cutting down on shadow sharpness and overall quality. However, there is no change to shadow draw distance, so there's no way to increase the point at which very near and moderate shadows are swapped out. The draw distance for the highest quality shadows is very short, so this cutoff point is super noticeable as you move through the world, and in general there's quite a bit of pop-in to the shadow system. In terms of performance, there's no significant difference between the 4 modes despite the noticeable quality change. At best, you're looking at a 2% improvement to average frame rates opting for low instead of very high, and that's simply not worth it when looking at the visual change. I'd keep this setting on very high unless you have a low-end rig. SSAO, or Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, is the most performance taxing setting in the game, and it also has a pretty significant impact on how the game looks. Especially in the dense forest and jungle areas of the map, SSAO adds a significant amount of shadowing and depth to the game world. Generally speaking, if you have the GPU horsepower to run this setting, you'll want to keep it enabled. However, the performance improvement from turning SSAO off is massive. We're talking about a 15% improvement to average frame rates, which is by far the highest performance uplift of any setting. Normally, I'd complain about such a huge performance hit from a single setting, but realistically, this game uses a lot of SSAO, so it does seem somewhat warranted. That said, if you're on a performance-constrained PC, this is the first setting I'd disable. You will lose a key effect of visual quality, but you'll also gain so much performance. Motion blur is one of those settings a lot of people choose to disable anyway, but in the case of Just Cause 4, you should definitely disable it because the motion blur implementation is pretty rubbish. It seems to use some sort of low quality sampling that just straight up looks bad. Turn it off and save your eyes the trouble. You'll also pick up about 2% to average performance in the process and nearly 5% to 1% lows, which is decent for an effect you won't want to use anyway. Edge fade is a cosmetic setting that basically turns on or off a vignette around the screen. It has no impact to performance, and it's a personal preference as to whether you want it on or off. Personally, I'll leave it off. Global illumination is similar to SSAO in that it does have a noticeable impact on how the lighting system works in Just Cause 4. When you enable the setting, the world's lighting becomes more realistic and more accurate, again, particularly in dense forest areas and in the cities. This is because the setting governs whether light can bounce off surfaces onto other surfaces or not. Disabling global illumination improves performance by 4%, and it's probably one of the first effects I'd disable if I needed more performance, along with SSAO. I think it's a more subtle effect than SSAO, so it's a prime candidate to switch off on mid-range hardware. Screen space reflections are a common effect used in games, and in Just Cause 4 it's most noticeable along the many water surfaces around the map. With SSR on, there are reflections on the water, and with SSR off, there are not. So pretty simple one here, and honestly I think the water looks pretty bad and flat without SSR on, at least worse than it does to begin with. Disabling SSR leads to about a 4% improvement to performance. However, unlike global illumination, I think this setting has a big influence on how the game world looks. I try and keep it enabled unless you are searching for a lot more performance. Final setting in the game is Bokeh depth of field, and this is one that has a rather subtle effect on the presentation but is visible at all times. Basically, distant objects will be very slightly blurred, and there's no blur with the setting off. In most scenes it's really hard to spot the difference, while the setting comes with a 2% performance hit, so I'd recommend disabling it for extra performance. And that's all the settings in Just Cause 4. There are basically only a handful that have a significant effect on visual quality and performance. Most settings either do nothing to improve performance at a significant cost to visuals, or provide such minor improvements you may as well disable them. The big ones are SSAO and global illumination. Whatever combination of those settings you choose will likely influence how the game looks and runs for you. Those with high-end systems should have both enabled. If you're after a bit of extra performance, I'd recommend disabling global illumination, and then mid-range or entry-level gamers should have both disabled. On a mid-range card, you're looking at up to a 25% performance improvement in the most intensive areas of the map simply from disabling those two settings. Most other settings I'd leave on the maximum available, with a few exceptions. I'd recommend turning off both motion blur and bokeh depth of field, and I'd set the anti-aliasing mode to FXAA because it looks better and performs better than temporal SMAA. If you are really hunting for the last few drops of performance, the only other settings that make a significant difference are screen space reflections and all of water quality, shadow quality, and LOD factor, but only when set to their lowest setting. So here are our three main hardware unboxed recommended settings profiles side by side, along with every setting at its maximum. We have both SSAO and global illumination enabled, just SSAO enabled, and neither enabled. We also have motion blur and depth of field off, FXAA is used, and every other setting is at maximum. Our baseline recommendation improves performance by 13%, then disabling global illumination brings that up to 18%, and then disabling SSAO as well will deliver you a 40% performance improvement. These are best case scenario figures in the jungle area of the map, where performance tends to be the worst. I still think there's a fair bit of work that could be done to improve pop-in for objects and shadows, plus there are plenty of weird glitches I experienced throughout the game. So I guess it's now up to Avalanche to get their act together and improve this engine. Considering the state the game launched in technically and visually, you'd have to think this engine is pretty much on its last legs and will need a significant overhaul for any future games. I'm not going to harp on any more about its visuals or performance. I think Steve did a great job of tearing this game a new one in his video, and I agree, it looks pretty mediocre and runs about as well as an ostrich with no legs. And unfortunately, a lot of the tweaks we recommend to get the game running better do make the game look even worse. Anyway, that's it for this video. Let us know what you think of Just Cause 4 in the comments below. Not sure if I should commit to playing this one yet myself, considering the mixed reviews online. I guess consider subscribing for more game optimization videos in 2019. And we also have a Patreon page where you can get access to our exclusive Discord chat and monthly live streams. I'll catch you in the next one.